Hello, everyone, and welcome to Our Small Majority. I'm your host, Christian Black,
And I'm your co-host, Matthew Goryczkowski.
and today we have Kristina Uban here, a neurobiologist at the University of California, Irvine. It's so great to have you here, Kristina.
I'm so excited. Thanks for inviting me on the show.
All right, we just have a few questions for you, and just to get your perspective. But just to give a little bit of background, we said that Christina worked at the University of California, Irvine as a neurobiologist, but she works in public health. What's that like, Christina? How did you even become a neurobiologist? And then how did you steer into public health rather than another department like neurobiology or the hard sciences or something like that?
Yeah, so it was just serendipitous or like stupid luck, honestly, and I really mean the luck part. I I I can't imagine a different trajectory, where I would open up my own lab, and I'm very happy to fall in public health, but it was just pure luck. I had never taken a public health course, and full disclosure, when a mentor of mine had recommended that I apply for the position, I just never imagined as a neuroscientist that I would ever be in public health. And I had to actually go on Google. This is very embarrassing now, but 2 years ago, or 2.5 years ago when I was interviewing, I had to go on Google and Google public health because
Hmm.
as a basic scientist, I didn't fully understand what public health really meant. And so I had to Google it and research it to apply for a job in the Department of Public Health. And I'm kind of,
Hmm.
the lonely neuroscientist in public health. And so I still connect with all the hard science, departments and go to their seminars and work with their faculty. But um, public health has expanded my entire perspective and changed the way I use the basic science tools in my research and just
Hmm.
completely made me rethink how I do research. And yeah, it's been fabulous, and it couldn't be more relevant than now during a pandemic and civil unrest. So I'm very fortunate to have landed in public health. There aren't many of us. I don't know of anyone else. I'm sure they're out there. If they're listening to this, please contact
Right.
me. The neuroscientists in public health.
Yeah, I can't think of anyone else. I mean, that was when we first met. I was like, "Oh, a neuroscientist in public health." Okay. What did you find while researching public health? What is your sort of brand of your definition of as a neuroscientist? What is public health, and why
Okay.
is it important for it to be studied?
Okay, that's a really good question because everyone will probably give you a different answer, which makes it a really neat question. To me, when I was searching for it, it really was broad. And I realized that there are multiple definitions, like textbook definitions, and it depends if you're doing a global public health course or epidemiology public health course. So there's all these different takes on public health. But in general, it's just, kind of overseeing the general health of people, of the citizens. And so just someone looking at it from a population level, really, in general. And so I was looking at teratogens, which is just basically something like a substance, like a toxin that can harm a fetus when exposed in utero during pregnancy. And I realized, oh, even though I was looking at how toxins harm the brain development during the fetal period and what that looks like in childhood and adolescence and adulthood, in terms of what the brain looks like, I realized, oh, this totally is a public health issue because a lot of
Mhm.
things can get in and harm the baby. So I realized I do fit in public health, which made me really excited to interview. But when I was talking with all the different faculty, when you go in for the interview process, you give a job talk and all the faculty are there, and usually like the department chair and the dean, and then you go around for the whole day, just one after another, talking to all the different faculty in the department, and they basically all do their own mini interview with you to see if they want to
Mhm.
work with you for a very long time. And they were so while they just, to me, they seem so different and so diverse. You had like just all these faculty working on everything from vaccines to earthquake frequency. And it's just, I mean, to toxins in the soil around the world. And it's just, I was just like, what is the common connection here? And the to me, the real common connection is trying to improve or optimize the environment, the context, I should say, in which we're all, living and developing in, for me, since I'm focused on development, but that we're all living in, just trying to improve that so we can just like live and be our optimal
Right.
versions of ourselves. And, unfortunately, there's a lot of health disparities that not everyone has the same experience. Some people just live day in, day out, exposed to a bunch of things that affect their health, and other people have less of
Mm.
that. So that's not really fair. We're all humans. So, it's just kind of trying to look out for everybody, a global human species population. Sorry, that was a really
Right.
long answer.
So, oh no, not at all, not at all. Well, inside of your own research, you said that I know that you look into fetal alcohol syndrome or the fetal alcohol spectrum disorder. Can you talk a little
Mhm.
bit about that and then sort of tie it into how you see differences between different groups of people?
Yes. Okay. So Um, I started out with basic models back in my graduate days. I did rat research looking at mechanisms, and yeah, we would breed rats. They would drink alcohol throughout pregnancy, and we'd look at the offspring. And so I was looking at a neurobiological, signature in the brain, in the hormones from the body that is specific to alcohol exposure via mom, drinking it or consuming it during pregnancy and affecting the offspring and the baby, and and then that just changes the way that the brain functions, and then the hormones that it produces, which then continue to change the way that the brain grows and develops and functions throughout life, and it makes them vulnerable for mental health disorders. So, uh, like 90% of people with a FAS or fetal alcohol syndrome diagnosis have a diagnosed and pretty severe, um, mood disorder, and like bipolar disorder or depression or anxiety, and 90%. So you just wonder, like, why do so many people have this, that were exposed to alcohol and other substances in utero? So doing rats, you take out everything. You take out sociodemographics, income, race, ethnicity, education. You take it all out, and they're just really genetically and environmentally homogenous. They're all very similar, and so it allows you just to look at these neurobiological signatures, and it really accelerates your understanding of it very quickly, something that takes a very long time to do in humans. And so I got really tired of working with rats, and I was done. And I felt like I did my part to science in that area, and moved on to humans. And I've just been with humans ever since. So I do MRI, magnetic resonance imaging, and take, fancy pictures of kids' brains, and then we look at kids who did not have exposure to substances in utero and kids who did, and look at the differences and relate it to mental health. We relate it to cognition, behavior. And what's interesting is the kids that, when I first embarked on this as a postdoctoral fellow after my PhD, I was working with kids, I realized that the typically developing kids are the kids that didn't have prenatal exposure to substances. um, the parents just were different. And then the parents of the kids who had fetal alcohol spectrum disorder that came in for the studies, it was a totally different scenario. So, for example, most of the kids that came in that had FASD, so fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, which includes anyone who's been impacted by prenatal alcohol exposure and has lifelong impairments from it, all of those individuals, like 90% of them, were adopted and not by a biological relative. And out of the kids that didn't have prenatal exposure,
Oh.
90% of them were living with their
Mhm.
biological parents. So it was totally flip flopped. So there was like adoption. Then when you looked at sociodemographics, almost all of the adoptive parents of the kids with FASD were making 100,000 plus as a combined family income. Whereas the kids without exposure, there was a range. There was a range from, making 30,000 a year as a family all the way up to like 150,000, and in general on average. And so the amount of money they made varied, The parents who adopted kids with FASD tend to have a very high education on average as a group compared to a range of educations and just non-exposed kids. So it just really hit me that a teratogen or a toxin that like harms a developing fetus is only part of the story. Yeah, it lives in the brain and that's real, but that's not the full story. You have to think about that context in which they're born into. And so when I dive deeper into the lives of these kids with FASD that were in my study, and I would just start asking, well, how old were they when they were adopted? And on average, they were 2.5 years old when they entered the home in which they would eventually be adopted at. So 2.5 years old is not how old they were when they were adopted. That's when they entered the home. I have a two and a
Mm,
half year old right now, Matthew and Christian. I don't like what if I just got her today. I mean, I've been with her for 2.5 years. I just so much
mhm,
happens in secure attachment and just in that basic brain development during those 2.5 years. So then it's like, well, what are these kids with FASD experiencing for those early months to years before they enter the stable home
mhm,
that in which they'll be adopted? They experience instability, they experience malnutrition, disease, infections, neglect, abuse sometimes, passing around of caregivers. I mean, this is a very common theme throughout multiple countries. This is not just United States. And so I'm like, well, how much of this is prenatal substance exposure altering the brain, causing mental health, problems later on for the rest of their life, versus this early exposure that just
right.
coincides with kids that were prenatal exposed. So to me, that really opened my eyes. And then when I landed in public health, everything changed. I mean, my mind just was blown when I landed in public health. Just really thinking more about who we're doing this research on and why we're doing the research on them. And my role as the objective, unbiased scientist, just I realize it's impossible to be that person. But as a basic scientist, you're taught to just go in there with no agenda, no political views. You just go in there, you do your study, you put them in a scanner, take a picture of the brain, take your hormone measures of them, and you study neuroendocrine, hormone brain relationships throughout childhood, adolescence, and into adulthood. And you just do your research. And then public health, I mean, my colleagues and my students were coming at me, asking me really intense questions nobody had ever asked me before I entered public health. So that was radically different. And I do feel like a little bit of an outsider now in neuroscience, and yet definitely an outsider in public health as well. So if there's any other neuroscientists in public health, please let's connect.
exactly.
Wow, that's a lot to take in. So
So my
and
students, so
there,
yeah, Christian's in the lab. Christian works in my lab
yeah.
too, and my students that are getting their PhDs in the lab, I mean, I've been very open with them. This is not going to be an easy career trajectory. I mean, you're doing something that is pretty unique,
Mhm.
getting a PhD in public health, but doing neuroimaging research is it's just unique.
So what's your role, Christian, in the lab? What do you do?
Well, my role in the lab is just, well, I'm just a postback. So like you and I, we just graduated from UCI.
Mhm.
So right now I'm trying to apply inside graduate school. And the reason why my interest and interest between Christina line up is that she combined neurobiological factors and basically neuroimaging, and then also another thing that we that I really want to mention is salivary bioscience. So basically taking salivary hormones or pretty much people's spit and running it and testing it. And the reason why that's so unique is that it's completely non-invasive and it's a lot easier to sample saliva
Mhm.
rather than blood samples or urine samples, especially for what I want to do involving inmates. So we might have a lot of backlash for, hey, can I have inmate 06218's blood?
Yeah.
So rather than,
Right.
oh, can I have his spit? So you might have like a little bit more leeway. Of course, you're gonna have like a few barriers and a few no's, but those interests definitely attracted me towards her lab. And she's just been mentoring me and showing me different MRI modalities, and different ways of measuring the brain and also sampling. Um,
Mm.
yeah, sampling people.
Yeah.
So
So
what
Christian took a salivary bioscience course, and then that's how we met. And Christian, you really striked me right when I first met you, because not only did you have this really unique interest in inmates, and a really, like, you want to change the system. Like you're saying, the system is broken. How we imprison, people, and you had this global perspective, and you worked with inmates, you know, with more of a global perspective, not just focused on the United States, which I thought was really interesting. And then you're really passionate about salivary biosciences. So the other plug for saliva is people can give the sample on their own. You don't need a phlebotomist
Mhm.
to take a blood draw. I mean, you basically can give them a tutorial video, so they could take it in their cell on their own. You don't even really need someone to be there, as long as you can do quality control and, protect the temperature of the sample later on, depending on what you're looking at.
Mhm.
Sometimes certain things you want to look at, biomarkers in saliva, can be sent in the mail. So it's not invasive. It doesn't hurt. You're spitting in a tube. Some people are more grossed out by it than others, but yeah, you can do it anywhere. So you can bring it to someone. You don't have to put the person in the lab. And,
Mhm.
when you step into a lab, you change. Your physiology changes. You're in a new environment. It's novel,
Mhm.
and novel experiences change your physiology. So if you really want to know how someone's functioning day in, day out, take their biological samples in that context. I mean, that's the cool thing about saliva. And it's really hard to do that with other biological specimens. But
It
that's
kind of
my
sounds
plug
like
for
how we're testing.
salivary biosciences.
It kind of sounds like how we're testing for COVID right
COVID.
now, right? With yeah, because it's all
Yeah,
salivary,
there
right?
is some
You
saliva.
yeah, you just get a Q-tip and then you get some saliva and you stick it in a tube and just send it off. So it sounds very similar to that.
So yeah, so that is supposed to be for virus, right? And
Yeah.
they're working on
Mhm.
making the antibody testing from blood, something you can do in saliva, which groups have already figured that out now, but I don't know when that'll become commercially available, but probably pretty soon. Yeah, it's super cool that you could just do
Hmm.
that, and get your DNA. You can get your COVID-19, antibody status, which, and it's not a perfect science, but neither are blood draws. It's not perfect. So, it's like, maybe really it has sensitivity and specificity, so it can accurately detect the thing you're trying to detect, like 93% of the time, all the way up to 97% of the time, depending on the context. But
Mhm.
so, it's best to do two of them, like 2 weeks apart, if you really, really want to know. Do two tests.
Hmm.
Right.
So what kind of confuses me is there's been a lot of research for the negative effects of alcohol already and toxins when you're having a baby, right? So why is it still such a
Yes.
huge issue? Why do people keep ignoring the side
Mhm.
effects?
Matthew, so that's, oh my gosh, I could talk about that forever. So I will try to keep it short. um, so alcohol consuming, communities, I'll say, because within a society, you see different, bubbles where there's more or less alcohol consumption. So I grew up in Minnesota. Minnesota, we consume some alcohol. I mean, like, a lot of alcohol. People who
Hmm.
drink, not everyone drinks, obviously, in Minnesota, but the people that do, it's pretty intense. Like, it's pretty, like, there's several drinks in a sitting, um, and you're definitely getting buzzed, or possibly drunk. It's definitely normalized to be tipsy and drunk, just on like a Wednesday happy hour thing there. Whereas when I moved to California, Southern California, it was relatively low. I mean, there weren't a lot of people are like, "Oh no, I've already had two things." And and then when you look at, SAMHSA or CDC or National Institute of Health, these organizations that track substance use throughout the states, California is pretty low in general, and the Midwest is really high, Wisconsin, and so but within those, like Texas, for example, great example. Austin actually has lower binge consumption patterns, whereas
Hmm.
around the Dallas kind of county area, there's very high. So even when you just go by county and county, it changes. And then you can go even zoom in even more. Who are you hanging out with? Do you hang out with a bunch of people who like to drink every single time you hang out? Or do you hang out with people who are like, I just don't like how it makes me feel. I don't ever drink. Or do you hang out with someone who's like kind of in between? Sometimes you drink, sometimes you don't, right? And alcohol is
Yeah.
just so ingrained in our society that nobody, this is the problem. So um and I really I don't know, what am I trying to say here? As a woman, I'm not saying that men can't understand this, but certainly as it might, I think it comes more easily for women to understand this, that particularly like of childbearing age, is that especially women who maybe are trying to get pregnant and know that you shouldn't do this. So let's say if theoretically in an ideal world, their doctor is telling them this, people know this around them, and they already have the knowledge that you should not consume substances, marijuana, tobacco, pain pills, alcohol during pregnancy or while you're trying to get pregnancy, because there's a period where you could be pregnant but you don't yet test positive, and so there's a period where you don't know, and that's just biology. So if you're trying to get pregnant,
Hmm.
you actually abstain that whole time if you want to be 100% sure you're not exposing your pregnancy. But when you're in a pattern with a group of people and friends and a network and a society, the community, the society, where substance consumption is really a regular part of just your social, being, um, then that abstinence feels very odd because you're the only one abstaining. And when you're in a social network where everyone's consuming at least something every time you get together, it all of a sudden puts 100% of that burden on the woman who's trying to get pregnant to just abstain on her own. So Australia's had a
Hmm.
lot of luck saying it's, of course, then when a kid has FAS or FASD, we're like, oh, why'd the mom drink? And it's like, well, dude, there's like everyone that hung out with her, the partner, if there was a part, if there was a supportive partner that was part of the life, parents, family members. If someone's trying to get pregnant and you know that, or they are actively pregnant, don't make them be the lone wolf practicing
Hmm.
abstinence. Everyone has a role and a responsibility for that child's outcome. And I think that's a really powerful message. So Australia went with that as a prevention method, saying your partner, your friend, your family member, your coworker, if they're pregnant, don't engage in substance use. Do sober activities with them so that you can support them during their pregnancy and not using substances. And to people who don't use substances, it probably sounds like, yeah, well, like, why do you need that? But for the people who do, this probably is really resonating with you because it's odd to just all of a sudden not use substances for 10 months when you've been using them like every Friday or every Saturday or whatever it
Hmm.
is, or every night for some people. So part of that is the problem, is that it's just so ingrained that women aren't being supported. Another part of the problem is that,
Hmm.
believe it or not, prenatal substance exposure to any substance is still not anywhere on the curriculum for med schools throughout the United States. So we have medical professionals responsible for our pregnant women carrying our future children who actually don't know about FASD or FAS, and it's not their fault. It's just our educational system. So at UCI, that's one thing we're trying to change and try to really promote that across med schools, is make sure we have curriculum um, in every single pre-med. Every single person who graduates pre-med should know about prenatal substance exposure as a toxin and FASD. And then everyone who graduates med
Hmm.
school should then have a graduate level training on it. And everyone who gets an undergrad degree in public health, this should also be on public health curriculum, but it's not. So I'm working hard now to try to get that implemented. And I'm not the only one. Other people are trying to work hard too. So part of the problem is that people don't know, Matthew, still. Like, people honestly don't
Hmm.
know that drinking during pregnancy is necessarily bad. Texas, it's actually, so a study I'm working on is a big study across the whole United States. And when you look at substance use in women who were pregnant 10 or 11 years ago now, actually most of the women who only use alcohol throughout pregnancy are in a household that is married. They have over a college or more education, and they make 100,000 or more combined as a family. So there's this idea that the reason why that's really striking to me is that doctors are less likely to tell and they're white. I should mention that. So the Caucasian, the doctors are less likely to tell a white Caucasian, well, upper class income, higher education woman, or to, if they're less likely to even ask about it. And if they do, oh, well, I do drink wine here and there with dinner. Is that okay? Sure. They say, like it's really interesting. But then when they go to serve,
Sure.
a population who has more minority, maybe a population who's minority and lower income and low education, they're more likely to be like, this is bad. Do not do this. We need to, like, they more likely to coach them on these positive
Wow.
behaviors. So it's
Hmm.
complex. We need to educate our medical providers to educate people. We need to educate the general public. And then when people do have education, we need to support them by engaging the whole community of their network to engage in sobriety during pregnancy alongside them. And it's if people use substances, it's hard. I mean, like, people lean on these things as celebratory, as stress coping mechanisms, as inspiration for
Hmm.
creativity, depending on whatever. People lean on these things, and when you do, a lot of people don't just randomly choose to stop for 10 months. So I think people underestimate how hard it can be for women to abstain for that period of time. And I think I was a bit surprised at how hard it seemed for women too, because I had the knowledge from my pre-doc training. So like for me, when I engaged in trying to, have kids, and I was very lucky that I was trying to have kids. So I knew that I was trying. And so it was very obvious to me. I just had needed to do 100% abstinence during that time. But I was kind of alone doing it the first time. And then the second time, my husband was like, yeah, I'm not going to even drink a beer or anything because I want to support you. Um, and it was really it was very powerful to me to have a partner who just was like, well, I'm not going to use it, you can't use, I'm not going to use it, just one person. And it like
Hmm.
was very powerful
Hmm.
experience. So yeah, and Australia's done that, so I think that the US should do that.
Yeah, having that
Wow.
support is important.
Well, I
Yeah, and if
guess
you
maybe
there's also
expanding on that. Yeah, I think like even expanding on that is like, well, if we move towards, women who don't have that support or those support groups when it comes to
Mhm.
certain minority groups or certain ethnic groups, like the father is nowhere to be found. He's not inside the household and she's going to be a single mother, or like they grew up in a bad neighborhood and, substance use is the way that she copes. It's always the way that she copes. Have you seen any patterns like that with the data that you've used, or is that like absent inside of the data? Because I know that you said that in Texas they usually ask those questions to white women, but in like minority groups and stuff, um, it's a different story.
Right. Well, so they don't even really ask higher income white women about substance use, period. So if
Mhm.
a woman's using, they aren't asked, they're not coached on it, they're not advised. But they, when a physician deems, someone to be part of what they would consider like label as higher risk, um, because of lower income. And so the thing that's important about lower income is that you tend to have other environmental factors that come along. So maybe lower income, so high quality nutrients in a diet definitely help offset harm done by prenatal alcohol exposure. So nutrition's key, and nutrition's kind of related to income to some degree, on average. And then the other part is, toxins. So lower income, you usually live in higher, denser areas, more urban areas, which is totally not true for rural areas. But in general, for the majority of lower income people throughout the whole United States, they live in a pretty dense area. So you get more noise pollution, air pollution, possibly higher risk for lead in drinking. Maybe the food they're consuming is wrapped a certain way that's leaking chemicals. Maybe they buy the first lotion off the shelf that's not, BPA, phthalate, free. So they get all these endocrine disruptors. There's all sorts of things that can harm a child, and it's not just like the one thing that is so awful. It's the combination. It's the perfect, storm of things that together they create a lot of harm for the fetus. But if you only have one or two of them on board, biology is resilient. So my message I give to my personal friends is definitely control what you can control. So please don't drink or use substances, if that's in your control, and do care to not consume like things that have high levels of BPA and phthalates and lotions and things like that. And maybe get an air filter. Like when I was living in LA and I was pregnant, I got an air filter for my air quality. These kinds of things that you could control, but don't freak out about the things you can't control. Like I definitely breathed a lot of bad air pretty much Monday through Friday, going to the metro to work every day. There's nothing I could
Mhm.
do about that. I mean, that's where I lived, that's where I was going. So you just gotta, stress is also harmful. So you gotta like let go of some things that you can't control. So yeah, I think encouraging people to have that social support and to support each other or to support pregnant women is really important. And then, Christian, you brought up a really good point. The most vulnerable women for having harm to their fetus via substance use are going to be those who don't have that support anyway. And it's not just because they're going to have more substance use, it's because of all those other things that come along when you don't have support, like instability, maybe like, not always having a safe place to sleep at night. And so what you see with, you see more kind of substance like alcohol use in this high income white kind of group in the study that we're looking at. But for the lower income groups, um, you actually see a lot less substance use, but then the women that are using lots of substances. It's not just alcohol, it's alcohol plus tobacco plus
Mm-hmm.
marijuana, occasionally heroin or cocaine here and there. And that's way more harmful than just one substance on board, obviously. So I think that's why you see more
Mm-hmm.
FAS and FASD with moms who, fall in the lower income bracket at that point during pregnancy, is that if they do use substances, they tend to use a bunch of different ones and they tend to use it at a higher dose, and higher doses cause more harm. So it's better to drink
Right.
7 servings of alcohol, 1 serving a day for 7 days than it is to drink 7 servings in one night. That's 7, so it's the same amount of
Mm-hmm.
alcohol at the end of the week that the fetus is exposed to, but that high dose is really harmful to the fetus. So,
Mm-hmm. Wow. Well, when it comes to going back into like public health and stuff, and like environmental injustices, or even any other social injustices that you might have come across inside of your research, when it comes to
mhm.
substance use and maybe even substance exposure, um if we broaden the horizons more and we look at the environment itself and like air pollution and things like that, is there anything that you found during your studies for like using the databases that you use like ABCD or anything like that, that sort of separates people inside different socioeconomic statuses?
Yeah, so I this is not my work. This is just something that I collaborated on. Mary Bell Gonzalez, Dr. Mary Bell Gonzalez with San Diego State University. Um, she she led these analyses, but she basically did a analyses, like a group factor analyses, which just you get to group variables that seem like they are connected together, but then you get to see how they relate to kind of childhood brain and cognitive outcomes. So she did include prenatal substance exposure in there and sociodemographic factors like race, ethnicity, and income to needs ratio. So it's not just about how much money you make, but like, how many people are living off that money. So income to needs. Um, and adjusted for where in the US you live and cost of living. So what she found, I mean, she really looked at, kind of physical metrics or measures, and then psychological measures, and then kind of more medical related ones, like which prenatal substance exposure kind of falls into that category. Um, and so, yeah, we know that there are things that can be really protective no matter what income bracket you're in. And, you know, definitely, school environment for both the kid and education level for the parent, no matter what income to needs, what race or ethnicity, it those are always going to be protective. So, and I'm not saying that because I'm a professor and I'm like promoting education. Like that's what we found. And this is not new. I mean, people found in previous studies that the school environment in which a kid, goes and interacts in day out is can be totally protective, even if they have to return home to a very chaotic, possibly abusive situation, if that school environment accepts them and makes them feel safe and supports them, that could be the difference in their lifelong trajectory of having, like, debilitating mental illness as an adult that leads to substance use problems or vice versa, um, or not, and being like a totally happy, healthy, productive adult that has, doesn't use substances or has complete control over them and it doesn't impact them negatively. It's really interesting. So that resilience versus risk, school environment is really wonderful. um, what else is interesting is that if you she just found this too, if you look at prenatal tobacco exposure, um, this Mary Bella Gonzalez again that I'm contributing to, if you look at prenatal tobacco exposure, you see really big effects if if you're exposed to tobacco, whether you're smoking it, which is all that she looked at. But certainly this would apply if your partner's smoking around you full time, like indoors, you still absorb it. Um, so those impacts on the developing fetus, looking 9 to 10 years later at that now 9 to 10 year old child's brain and how they're performing in school and cognition, it's really interesting that you see huge effects if they're exposed to prenatal tobacco or not. And I see the same with prenatal alcohol exposure. Um, but when you actually put in all those covariates for race, ethnicity, income, those effects start to diminish a little bit. And what that tells me as
Mm-hmm.
a scientist, one main interpretation of that, there's a few different ways you can interpret that, but the way that I think about it is prenatal substances cause harm. Like, that should be completely clear. If you want your child's brain to be the optimal biological version it could possibly be, no substance exposure during pregnancy is the way to go, as much as possible. Um, but all the other different sociodemographic factors also impact that child development. So if you have a lot of resilience factors on board, like good nutrition, stability, safety, um, like those things affect your physiology, less stress in your life. All those things will help kind of offset harm by substance use, even though substance use is still bad. But if you have a lot of stress, instability, poor nutrition, exposure to lead, air pollution, and any other toxins, it's very likely that then any substance use you add into that mix is going to just
Mm-hmm.
cause way more harm because there's already insults happening to that developing fetus. So that really, unfortunately, in our country, we have huge, race and race-based disparities based off of where you live, what kind of toxins you're exposed to in your environment, the kind of health care you get, how much you get paid to do the same job that the white guy gets paid to do. um it's just like we have so many disparities across the board, so that shows up in health. And we all,
Mm-hmm.
if you've done a degree in public health, you know all about health disparities and equity and equality and all of those things. So I think as a neuroscientist, I was very narrow focused, thinking, well, we're all biologically the same. We're all a human species, right? Like, we're all the same. So if I drink alcohol during pregnancy and someone else different from me drinks alcohol during pregnancy, our babies are going to be affected. Yeah, there's genetic differences, but it's going to harm them both. And the reality is,
Mm-hmm.
don't ever drink. I'll just keep saying that over. Don't ever drink. If you do, don't freak out. Pay attention to nutrition. Try to manage stress and healthy coping mechanisms, and try to avoid other toxin exposures, if it's in your control. But the most important thing is stop using. Women. So this is the other thing that we found out, Christian, since you had asked me. We looked at women who did not use substances, period. And then they got pregnant
Mm-hmm.
and they continued to just not use substances. And we looked at their child brain and cognitive outcomes. Then we looked at moms who did use substances. The number one substance use used in pregnancy in the United States right now, from my data, it suggests that it is number one is tobacco, number two is marijuana, and then alcohol is a very close third behind marijuana. They're almost tied. So that's kind of what's being used right now in general. So women who use substances get pregnant and accidentally expose their pregnancy early on. But then when they find
Oh.
out that they're pregnant, they stop using their child's outcomes reflected by their brain measures and the child's cognitive behavior or cognitive performance, sorry, and behavioral problems. So we look at like attention deficit disorder, impulsivity, and because that's another common thing with fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, those moms' kids have slightly elevated behavioral problems and slightly lower cognition, and it's reflected in the brain compared to moms who don't use substances, period. No accidental exposure before they knew they were pregnant. But then when you look at
Hmm.
moms who used substances before they knew they were pregnant and then continued on after they knew they were pregnant, you see even more behavioral problems, lower cognitive performance, and this is again reflected in the brain. So the the message I would say is if you accidentally expose your pregnancy to substances, stopping is significant. It significantly
Hmm.
improves your child's outcome if you stop using once you know you're pregnant. So don't totally freak out, but because I get a lot of people coming to me kind of behind the closed doors, like I accidentally exposed,
Right.
like what does that mean? And the reality is it's still not good. It's not setting your child up to be their optimal version, but it's not like they can still perform, potentially at a chronological, age appropriate grade level in school and things like that. But there is a difference as a group. You still see it
Hmm.
even with accidental early exposure. So yeah, so it's complicated. And this is, I should mention, these results I'm talking about are from the Adolescent Brain Cognitive Development Study in the United States, which is all typically developing kids. So none of these kids, in theory, have FASD.
Hmm.
And we're still
Hmm.
seeing these effects. These are kids who, at age 9 or 10, are in their age appropriate grade. They're performing normally. There's no signs of disability, like FASD. And we still see effects of prenatal substance exposure, which I think is really
Wow.
profound.
What do those effects look like?
They look like more symptoms that kind of push you along the scale to, have more symptoms in line with ADHD. So they don't necessarily have
Hmm.
ADHD diagnosis, but they have more heightened symptoms getting you closer to a ADHD diagnosis. They have more symptoms of being like impulsive. So impulsivity is something that, as your prefrontal cortex matures, it helps kind of, you really want to eat that, piece of cake, but you're like, I should really wait. And so it's the prefrontal cortex like making you delay that and plan for the future. And so impulsivity is kind of a way for us to assess like damage to the prefrontal cortex, um, and the regions it interacts with closely. So it also looks like in the brain, it looks like smaller subcortical brain volumes. So specifically smaller thalamus, smaller hippocampus. And then we also found with cognition, slightly reduced global cognitive functioning just across the board
Mm.
with
Right.
prenatal substance exposure.
Mhm.
So what's interesting is I had to run my analyses. I didn't know statistically how to do this. So in statistics, um, we do these things called covariates. So if I want to know the impact of prenatal substance exposure on the brain of a kid, but I think it might be different if, based on income or based on income, meaning maybe that's reflective of, quality of prenatal care or nutrition. And I wanted to, I thought that race or ethnicity was important or geography. So like where they lived was important. Then I would put all those things in my statistical model as a covariate. And so I'd control for it. So
Hmm.
I'm still just asking the question, does prenatal substance exposure change the brain? Period. And then I don't have to think about what, race they are or what income bracket they are in. I don't have to think about it because I just put it in the model. I covary for it, and I can just say, yes, prenatal substance exposure, shows up and it affects the brain, and it's related to more behavioral problems. So that's a really nice way. That's how I, as a basic scientist and a neuroimager, have always been trained to kind of just tuck these in as a covariate. And then when I started doing these analyses, I just felt like this is where public health really expanded my brain. I felt like I wasn't really doing like race or ethnicity, based health disparities. It's due. Uh, it I wasn't really looking at it. I was just kind of sweeping it under the rug by putting it as a covariate. And that's just all I've been trained to do. So I felt like we needed to do something a little bit more. So I actually did 3 separate sets of analyses. I did one only in low income. So these are combined families who make 50,000 or less a year for the whole family. We did middle income, which was 50 to 100,000, and we did high income, which was 100,000 plus. And I wanted to know, does prenatal alcohol exposure show up in the brain and with behavioral problems and with lower cognitive functioning in all of these income brackets? And what's interesting is the answer is yes, it does. It shows up in all of them. But the effect size, so how big of the effect that prenatal alcohol exposure impairs all of these things, it gets increasingly small as you get to higher income. So the you see prenatal alcohol exposure has the biggest impairments in the lower income bracket, and then less impairments in the middle income bracket, and then the fewest impairments in the high income bracket. And you
Wow.
can subdivide that by race and ethnicity. And what you find out is, um, for whatever reason, I couldn't even run my analysis. And this is why I could not really run my analyses in race and ethnicity, is that the patterns of substance use in participants of the ABCD study, just you don't have everyone of every race and ethnicity for every income bracket using substances. For example,
Hmm.
I couldn't find any women who identified as Black or African American who made, as a combined family, 100,000 or more. There was a group of those women. None of them used substances during pregnancy.
Wow.
So I just find, and then for women who identify as being Asian, like there was like no, there were some that used, there was definitely some that used some substances in, I think it was the middle and the higher income bracket, but in the low income bracket there were none. There were, we, to be fair, there were only like 10 women who identified as Asian that were in the lower income bracket in this huge study of 11,000 plus families. But so it gets really hard in science, and this is how public health has challenged me as a
Hmm.
basic biomarker neuroscientist, scientist, is all these nuances of how race and ethnicity and income, do impact your day in, day out, quality of life here in the United States as a whole, on average, as a group. All of those things do show up in your biology, but it's really hard to study them because it's hard to find the same sample size to fit in all these subgroups of, when you divide it by income and race and ethnicity. So it's I just found it really interesting that there's just some groups
Hmm.
of race plus income that just don't use substances.
And
So
why do you think there is like that lack of representation between races or different income? Like, how do we improve that? Because if there's not enough representation, then you can't draw accurate conclusions saying,
right.
yes, like there is a difference between African Americans and white people, or there isn't a difference if, you only have 10 African Americans compared to 10,000, Caucasians. So, yeah,
Right.
like
Well,
how
so
how do you sort of jump that hurdle inside your own research?
I think honestly, this is such the easy way out, but honestly, we're kind of required to keep analyzing and publishing, even when you do see these flaws. And so you do your due diligence, you report it, you say this is a limitation. I couldn't subgroup divide these teratogens by race ethnicity because I literally, out of the like 75 women that participated who identified as Black or African American and made over 100,000 dollars a year, like none of them endorsed using any substances. So I literally can't even do the analyses because I have no sample in that bracket. And so I think it's interesting. Why are those women not using substances? What is it about being Black or African American and making 100,000 more dollars a year that is protective? Right? Because we have lots of white women who make over 100,000 a year that use substances in the study. So what is it about women who identify as Black or African American? I think that's really, I think that you can look for more research questions to do more studies, but I don't have the answers. What do you guys think?
Well,
Oh, Matt, you go first because I got my answer.
well, I mean, I have a few things, but they're very uneducated guesses. Um, but I guess a question I'd have is like, are there other diseases or issues that are more prevalent, like health issues that are more prevalent in black women that aren't in white women? Are there differences, or is it always that, um, or is it always like wealthy white women who do more substances and have these more issues with their children, or is it just this one specific instance? Because I think that might open up to even more questions there.
Mhm.
You mean, is it just in the study that we're finding this, or is this really a thing that is true in the US? Is that what you're asking?
No, no. Like, are there other studies that have similar outcomes where it shows like where that wealthy white women have more issues, health issues in general?
No, I not that nothing nothing terribly obvious comes to mind. Um it's also complicated because it's not really just about it's I mean, income and race are just proxies really for kind of how you know what what quality of healthcare you're getting, how you're treated when you
Mhm.
show up for your healthcare. We all know, I mean, there's been tons of articles this past year that, women who um are a minority, and particular women who have darker skin, like whatever race or ethnicity, but if they have darker skin often, and I think one study actually said it was mostly African American women, they're just they when they have a lot of pain following childbirth, they're not taken seriously, and so there's a high mortality rate. And when white women complain about
Mhm.
pain, they're taken more seriously, and this is seen across the whole medical field. I mean, these are unbiased, or sorry, these are subconscious biases that society's kind of conditioned people to like have these weird, like, racist thoughts about people. So
Mhm.
like,
Mhm.
that that like a woman who's African American would should not be taken as seriously, that maybe she like it's just I mean, it's just crazy. But I mean, it's crazy to say these and intelligently talk about it, but the reality is these still continue on among highly trained, intelligent, compassionate people. And so these are like subconscious things that are driving in part, racial disparities in health. And
Mhm.
sorry, Matthew, I don't think I really answered your question. I don't know that there's an
Well,
obvious explanation for it. I think it's going to be complicated, and I don't know the answer.
well, so if wealthy white women are like, "Hey, I'm gonna get good health care," they're not used to having these issues. Do you think
Mhm.
that maybe they are less careful because of that?
Oh, I see where you're going with that. Yeah. The
Yeah.
other thing is, there's a bunch of studies that have been around for a while. I think they're just kind of resurfacing now, because of the times with Black Lives Matter protests, and everyone just kind of having a whole nationwide awakening for some people who were not awake to it, the to racism in our country, systemic and institutionalized racism. And
Mhm.
um, I think people are starting to become more aware of these things. But I think so. I think as soon as a kid's in preschool, the studies show that it doesn't, you know, the teachers they're more likely to uh, notice bad, negative, unwanted behaviors if a kid is Black or African American, or a minority. I mean, I don't mean to just focus on that, but definitely just minority in general. And if the kid is white or Caucasian, um, they tend to focus more on the behaviors that they're looking for, the good ones, like they're listening or they did a good drawing. And both kids are exhibiting good and bad behaviors. There's no difference between the kids. It's how the teachers, like, there's this bias to look for bad things in kids that
Mhm.
are that are darker skin, and then the kids with lighter skin, they look for good things. And they've even done this sometimes in teachers, and so this happens at preschool. So, like, if you're a kid and you go enter preschool, you're already in a different world. And so,
Mhm.
I mean, I think I'm preaching to the choir with you guys, but like, and probably to the audience that listens to the show, but like, yeah, I mean, I think these race, racist kind of system, like, like bullshit in our country, it happens early, it happens young. And then flash forward, that little girl that was, a 3-year-old in a preschool, is now, I mean, I would be a slightly distrustful, I don't know, if,
Hmm.
yeah, you might have to be more guarded. And if you are a Karen and you just like wear your white privilege and, all of this stuff, then maybe you're less careful because your kid's going to be like favorably treated down the road. So if your kid has a little
Hmm.
ADHD, you guys, I'm like going way out on a limb. This is very unscientific of me, but if you're,
Oh
I
no, go
like,
ahead.
I like, speculating. So like, yeah, if you're,
Hmm.
I don't think it's a conscious decision like, oh, I don't have to worry so much. I just think it's that, well, my neighbor did it. My aunt, drank, or my friend drank, or my, so and so drank, and their kid's totally fine. Their kid's like rocking it at soccer and like whatever on the honor roll. So clearly drinking is not bad during pregnancy because I can just list 6 people who did it. Or clearly
Mm.
marijuana in Boulder is so Colorado so accepted. All these white, higher income women, oh, it's no big deal. I can smoke, pot. It's natural. And then, the more people that do it, it becomes normalized. And the kids probably do, okay in school because like they're already looked at favorably being white,
Hmm.
and their parents have
Hmm.
high education, and parents who have higher education, we know, tend to say yes to their kids more, and parents with lower education tend to say no to kids more. But
Hmm.
I think that that's way simplified. I think that
Hmm.
there's kind of this idea that women who say no to their kids a lot are probably raising their kids in contexts where they are fearful for their child's safety and they need to say no,
Hmm.
right? So
Hmm.
I don't know, you guys. Yeah. I mean, you could go on and on for how all of these things are linked up, but remember, our brain isn't predetermined. Like it's not like the egg and the sperm meet and boom, you know exactly who Christian or Matthew or Christina or who any of us are going to be. Our environment is shapes how those genes are expressed and how we are built at every single step. And even when we're entering puberty, and all these adult level like hormones come on board and kind of slow down this plasticity and this ability to be malleable to the environment around you and make you more adult like, um even still, we're still always affected by our environment. And that day in day out interaction, even if it's subtle, a subtle interaction that's chronic, that happens over and over and over again for year after year after year, I mean, like, of course that's going to show up in your brain and your health, like duh. I mean, so I think people that don't, aren't totally into Black Lives Matter, or aren't totally into changing our system and making it work for everybody equally, and really looking at it and looking at their own role in it, I think that they downplay how significant racism
Hmm.
really gets in and impacts people. I mean, they just downplay it. But I can tell you it's significant. It shows up in your
Right.
biology.
Right. Well, going in more on an institutional level, like working with coworkers or board members and things like that, and actually trying to promote more research towards the parts that are lacking, like, hey, we should investigate more of why this is happening inside ethnic groups and stuff like that. Do you see enough representation or enough push in positions of power in order to make that change happen, is either inside your own research or inside research that you've collaborated with?
Yeah, so I can tell you that, yeah, being in the developmental neuroimaging field, which basically means I study development. We all study development and of the brain because we're neuroimagers and we're taking pictures of the brain, and that means that we're doing human research. Um, I can tell you that we're a lot of white people, and you know, a, and powerful, like doing big studies with a lot of taxpayer money towards these grants, and we're you know um, in high positions of power. And I don't know that we all necessarily fully realize that. I mean, I certainly know that every year that I've been in public health, I realize it more and more. Um, and and you start to realize that the questions we think are a priority are through a white dominant like societal perspective or lens, because we're the ones that are in the driver's seat. And it's not that we're doing it like to be racist. It's just like we have no diversity in the leadership. So all the way down. And so it is really lacking. And I think there's been a lot of discussion of how do we get more grants and funding for scientists who are of minority to come have a seat at our table and help, bring the diversity to our studies and help bring diversity to the interpretation of our results and this and that. But the reality is that's just still giving us the acknowledgement for that work, right? And what we really
Hmm.
need is a whole new table chosen and designed and placed by minorities or scientists who are a minority group and doing their own studies, driving their own research agenda, executing it in their way, right? And so it's not just having more funding for underrepresented scientists to be part of our stuff. It's just like there needs to be more funding to let them be independent, like we are, like we're allowed to be.
Hmm.
And it really comes kind of down to power. And I don't know who's pulling all the strings. I have theories, but maybe that's after. I don't know if I want to record that, but like I'm not tenured yet. Wait till I'm tenured.
Yeah.
I'll come back to
Yeah,
this
I
once I
would
get
go right
tenure.
into
Um, so yeah, I don't know who's pulling those strings, but I also know, Christian, I know that you wanted me to talk about South Africa, so I could kind of
Hmm.
jump into that a little bit.
Okay.
So as a basic neuroscientist, because it's related to the racing, as a basic neuroscientist, brand new in my career, had gotten my PhD, wrapping up my postdoc, finished having a couple maternity leaves in there. And I was ready to start my own lab. And I was looking hard. And I wrote a grant that, if funded, would, really give me a lot of leverage to get hired. And because I would pay my own salary. So it's really good. People are more likely to hire you when you can pay your own salary with a grant. And so I wrote this grant, and half of the grant is focused on South Africa, specifically in Cape Town, because Cape Town is known as the global, like, hub for prenatal alcohol exposure and substance exposure in general, and has the highest rates of fetal alcohol syndrome and just all
Oh.
different types of, um, effects under the FASD spectrum. So there's estimates as high as 27% at times, depending on what year you look, of kids being born who have been impacted. So not just exposed to alcohol, but they have effects. Like they're definitely affected detrimentally because of alcohol. There's some meth and marijuana exposure and tobacco, lots of tobacco. So anyways, so I was like, oh yeah, of course, like write a good grant. Well, go where there's high prevalence, right? And then I can go in the population and there and do a really good job of understanding this. So that seemed like a no-brainer. If I had been in a neuroscience department, I would still be doing that study saying this is the global hub and I'm going to look at the effects of prenatal alcohol exposure on the brain. But I now flash back to our discussions in this podcast. Teratogen exposure is not all equal. It depends on all the other exposures: stress, stability, nutrition, right? Toxins, like what are the walls of your house painted with or built out of, right?
Mhm.
So all of those things, just like, honestly, it just didn't, it's just new for us in neuroscience. We're kind of just awakening to it in the last like 5 years or so to speak. And public health has been awake to this for I don't even know how long, a very long time. So me just awakening to the fact that I'm not studying a human brain in isolation, because we're all humans, but that this environment so intensely impacts us. I realized when I got over there in South Africa, I realized that all the participants are living in a series of townships known as the Cape Flats, and they have
Hmm.
generational displacement by foreign white people taking their land away,
Mm-hmm.
making them into vineyards, benefiting from the moist, air of the ocean, hitting up the mountains of gorgeous, gorgeous Cape Town. And they literally took land away from uh, people in South Africa who were Black, and they took their land and then had them live on like an arid spot. And this, I'm not the best person to give the history, but just this is a Cliff
Mm-hmm.
Note version. So, and then basically over time, this community refused to leave despite government trying to take their little shanties, like kind of shack, self-built shack kind of style housing down. They just kept rebuilding and they became a community, and it's huge. It's like bigger than Los Angeles. It's like huge when I went there. And so we have, so now I'm studying prenatal alcohol exposure on the brain. Wouldn't that be so easy if I could just go in and study that in these kids? But now I'm realizing, well, they have cross-generational displacement via racism. There was a apartheid just, barely like 20 years ago. And um, everyone in the study is Black. And so there's like no racial diversity whatsoever. Pretty much most of them live in like either government housing or what we call a Wendy shack, which is kind of more like, the way I see it is like metal, and I don't know what's in that metal. Is it lead? Is it other toxins? Like, what are these kids like? Where's their water coming from? Is it clean? Probably not. What's the sanitation thing like? They're often sharing bathroom with multiple families, and I just realized like I'm not even like this community doesn't even really probably care about prenatal alcohol exposure. That's like so far on the totem pole of their priorities. And here I am, a white
Mm-hmm.
American foreigner, just perpetuating this cross generational white person taking advantage of like people of color. And I didn't even know I was, but here I have the government
Mm-hmm.
paying me to do this research, and I have this obligation to fulfill this agenda. And so what I've come up with is just trying to do it in a better way that acknowledges how
Mm-hmm.
limited this study is, that we don't have all. Anyway, so there's all these caveats, right? And that maybe they have a hub. They're known as the global hub or the hot spot for FAS, because maybe alcohol consumption is just like a byproduct of cross generational displacement and systemic racism
Mm-hmm.
and poverty. And maybe alcoholism
Mm-hmm.
is just a symptom and it's not the cause. And here I am just studying a symptom and not
Right.
addressing like the much bigger picture. And so when I try to communicate this to my collaborators, it kind of is like hit and miss. And that's what probably, it's a journey. I mean, people are definitely receptive to listening, but mm, sometimes more so than
Mm-hmm.
others. So you kind of have to take your time. And
Right.
so as I'm white or I Caucasian, whatever you want to call it, I'm like, and so I pretty much during this whole civil unrest during the pandemic have been really trying to do my part to look inward in science as a white person and just get like whose eyes aren't fully open to systemic and
Right.
institutionalized racism. All right. Well, it's happening in our study. What can we do within our study that's within our control, and just working with other white people to like get them to like really understand this, because academia is often called that ivory tower for a reason.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know that everyone in those positions that are considered ivory tower understand what that ivory
Right.
tower really means. I think they could say it, they could say the words, but I don't know that they like feel it, like they really know it.
Mhm.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
I'm just talking about white academics that I work with. And some are way advanced from me. I mean, like way further down their like path. So I'm kind of like a mid-ground person in my ability to see and identify like institutionalized racism. Since I'm part of an institution, I'm part of, I'm funded by National Institute of Health, which is your lovely tax dollars paying for research. I'm part of, a university that educates people, and so it's, I'm definitely in institutions with
Right.
power, and I can identify it, but it's I'm getting better at it. But I realize that some of the people I work closely with can't really see it, but they can say the words. But if you ask them for specific examples, they can't really see it fully. yet.
Right.
So that's what I feel like my role is. And South Africa was very eye-opening in
Mhm.
that
Hmm.
whole realization about 2 years ago. And mostly because of my colleague, I went over there, Stephanie Bodison, um, really helped me navigate that situation. So,
Yeah,
Awesome.
I think looking at it that way is very humane, because I do think like a lot of research is just looking at things like subjects instead of like human beings.
Hmm.
well, and yes, and
Or
yeah,
it's
Matthew,
yeah.
especially basic scientists, right? I mean,
Hmm.
we do call them subjects, and it's not because it's not because we're trying to take a human aspect out of it, so to speak. But I guess it kind of is, though, in a way. It's like, well, but we're all biological. Like we all, unless you've had like a major accident, like with a pole that like impaired your brain,
Hmm.
like through part of your brain. I mean,
Phineas
we all have
Gage.
the same brain. Yeah, exactly. So we're all we all have, for the most part, we all have the same brain regions, although some newer research in the last couple of years suggests maybe we all have slightly different subnuclei, which I think is really interesting. But we all have like the same brains. I mean, we all have um, all these similar things. So it's easy as a basic scientist to be like, well, I'm studying the brain. What brain? The human brain. Oh, well, I'm studying the rat brain. I'm studying, the non-human primate brain, or, like the C. elegans, like a little worm brain, like, more interneurons rather than a brain, but like, fish brain. Like, so when you ask, what are you, well, what kind, you're studying brains. I mean, like we literally identify it by the species. And then that's kind of as far as we go. And that really was a lot of my training. And so I think public health, landing in a public health situation has made me see the human part. And one of my best friends is a humanitarian, and she gets really frustrated with science sometimes because we just get data and then we say, we give you a plot, a result. And, it's like, oh, there was a disaster in this country and UNICEF went in and cleaned it up. And now we have, 2 out of 2,000 that are having trouble accessing food every day or something. And so that's a huge improvement, right? Only 2 out of 2,000. So that's huge. But then as a humanitarian, my best friend will go there or talk to people who are working there with her nonprofit organization she works for. And they're like, oh my gosh, it's so bad. Yeah, they have like barely any food and they're living in like mud. And like what baby is supposed to learn how to crawl and roll when they're in a refugee camp on a muddy floor? Like who, like, you know what I'm saying? Like these, just the actual human day-to-day lived experience of the parents who are trying to just give their kid, they fled something that was completely out of their control, and they're trying to give their kid a space to just develop in. And that's like all they have. They don't have money to fly anywhere else. They don't have any ability to go anywhere else. They don't have like a passport. They don't, I mean, they literally are at the mercy of like just the situation that they're in, like as a refugee. And it's, so my humanitarian friend does criticize science for just like being numbers, and it's really helped me in my professional growth.
Hmm.
And then I think I make her a little more trusting of scientists. Like we're not all bad, but like humanitarians and scientists, we should work hand in hand. Like I don't know why we're separate. We should work hand in hand. So it was a
Yeah.
And
good
it
point.
definitely
Yep.
highlights like intersectionality between disciplines inside of university, since we sort of separate like social sciences from hard sciences. So if you have that combination, it gives you a whole new perspective. um but we are over the 1 hour mark. We hate to like keep you, because I know you've had a long day. Like you've had the meeting that we did earlier today, and then now this podcast. So I just wanted to see where you were at, and if you wanted to end the meeting, or if you wanted to still discuss a few other
Oh
things.
yeah, no, yeah, this is great. I'll definitely take you up on an end because I will probably go to bed now.
Okay.
You guys,
Not a problem.
thank you so much, and I'm so excited to start listening to some of the episodes. And thank you so much for having me on the show. And it was fun. It was really fun. And
Yeah. And
um,
thank you so
Go
much for
ahead, man.
teaching. Thank you so much for teaching two dudes about healthy pregnancy practices and neuroscience.
hey, now you know. Now you know when that time comes and you have that, pregnant friend or partner or, whatever in your life, coworker, like, you play a significant role.
Thank you again so much for listening to Our Small Majority and joining us with Kristina Uban. In our next episode, we'll be meeting Karamet Ryder, another professor at the University of California, Irvine. Now, what Ryder does is she focuses on the effects of solitary confinement in prison. And we're going to go to the famous or infamous Pelican Bay in Northern California. We'll see you next time. And again, thank you for listening.